My name is Johan Nilsson. I am a postdoctoral researcher in the history of religions at the Center for Theology and Religious Studies at Lund University in Sweden. Currently, I am conducting a research project about Buddhism and Theosophy in the late 19th and early 20th century. When it comes to research about esoteric movements like Theosophy, it is my firm belief that it can discover a lot about how such movements have been intertwined with the history of other religious movements and the history of society in general. Theosophy was one of many esoteric movements that emerged around the world during the end of the late 19th century, and today it is generally accepted that the Theosophical movements, and to a lesser extent the broader environment in which Theosophy operated, contributed to the global interest in, and in some cases the global spread of, religions with historical roots in India. Theosophy stimulated the interest in Buddhism and Hinduism outside of, and to some extent inside of, Asia. The movement popularized beliefs and practices taken from or attributed to religions with historical roots in Asia. This was the case, for example, with belief in reincarnation, the practice of some forms of meditation, and the practice of vegetarianism. Furthermore, Theosophy influenced how religions from India and India itself was understood and sometimes misunderstood globally during the early 20th century. For that reason, the history of Theosophy is to some extent intertwined with the history of Buddhism and Hinduism. In my lecture, I will illustrate these points by looking more closely at the way in which the Theosophical movement played a role in the introduction of Buddhism to Sweden at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. My lecture will have three parts. First, I will talk about the Theosophical Society and the Theosophical movement in general. Secondly, I will describe the arrival of Theosophy in Sweden, and thirdly, I will give an introduction to the interest in Buddhism within the Swedish Theosophical movement. The Theosophical Society was a movement that grew out of the late 19th century esoteric environment in Europe and North America. Theosophy can be seen as a religious movement or an esoteric or cultural movement. All of these terms apply to some aspects of Theosophy, but none of them are exhaustive. The original organization was created in 1875 in New York City in the United States. Among the early members were several that had ties to contemporary esoteric movements like spiritualism. The original intent of the Theosophical Society was quite open and non-dogmatic. According to early versions of its bylaws, the society pursued goals such as aiding its members in developing what they termed the, quote, inner psychic self. They also strove to oppose the perceived cultural impact of what they called materialism of science and every form of dogmatic theology. They strove to aid in the creation of what they termed a brotherhood of humanity and to spread knowledge about Asian religious traditions, quote, especially the pure esoteric teachings in the Vedas and the philosophies of Buddha, Zoroaster, and Confucius. During its first decades, Theosophy would, however, become heavily associated with the more specific teachings of its most influential members, primarily Helena Blavatsky and later on Annie Besant, W.Q. Judge, and Charles Ledbetter, among others. Especially during its early years, Theosophy became closely tied to its most charismatic and influential representative, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, often called Madame Blavatsky. Blavatsky was born in a Ukrainian aristocratic family in 1831. When she was still a teenager, she was married against her will to a much older man named Nikifor Blavatsky. As a consequence of this, she ran away and traveled widely in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Although she eventually reunited with her family, Blavatsky would later claim that during these travels she established contacts with mysterious spiritual masters who revealed their teachings to her. Some of these teachings would form the basis of Blavatsky's published books, such as Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. and would, to some extent, become the de facto teaching of the Theosophical Society. In 1878, Blavatsky and the president of the Theosophical Society, Henry Steele Olcott, decided to relocate the movement to India. Reasons for the move include the role played by India as a home of spiritual wisdom in the Theosophical worldview, as well as the fact that the society had established contacts with the Hindu reform movement, the Arya Samaj. Little came of these original contacts, but Theosophy started to expand rapidly after the move to India. During the 1880s and 1890s, the Theosophical Society became established in many parts of the world, becoming a truly international organization, opening over 100 local chapters worldwide. Many were located in India, but local lodges were opened in places as diverse as Shanghai in China and Havana in Cuba. The Theosophists focused heavily on disseminating their ideas and published a number of periodicals, something which likely contributed to the spread of the movement. After the death of Blavatsky in 1891, the movement split. The part of the organization that had its headquarters in Adyar in India eventually came under the leadership of Annie Besant. Besant involved herself in a number of social issues as well as in Indian politics. She also developed some of the teachings of Blavatsky further in her books. Early Theosophy had a comparatively large cultural impact. During the late 19th and early 20th century, the movement was popular among artists and writers, but also in socially and politically engaged circles. In some European countries, Theosophy was quite popular within the women's suffrage movement. Furthermore, Theosophy influenced the early 20th century interest in vegetarianism, cremation, and animal rights in Europe. Although Theosophy can be said to have lost some of its cultural impact later in the 20th century, the movement is still around. Today, there are several organizations that claim roots in the original Theosophical Society, as well as a large number of movements like Anthroposophy that are heavily influenced by the early Theosophical teachings. So, what were the teachings of the Theosophical Society? We should remember that the society officially had no teachings in which the members were required to believe, but the writings of Blavatsky and other influential members presented a relatively specific worldview. One of the core beliefs in the theosophical literature is the concept of ancient wisdom. Blavatsky's books, like Isis Unveiled, are full of references to superior spiritual techniques, sciences, and even technology that she believed had existed in ancient cultures. Knowledge of the true meaning of these had, according to theosophical writers, been passed down through history by secret spiritual masters. These teachings could, according to Blavatsky and others, also be found in what they understood as the inner esoteric meaning of many religious texts. However they survived, these teachings were thought of to be of great importance for humanity in modern times, and supposedly held the key to solve the spiritual and social problems of modernity as these were understood by the Theosophical movement. One of the more distinctive characteristics of the Theosophical teachings was the belief in what Theosophists called the Masters. The Masters were described as a group of highly evolved and spiritually developed individuals who were thought to have revealed the Theosophical teachings to Blavatsky and other members of the society. Blavatsky and many other Theosophists also claimed that the Masters were in possession of various superhuman powers. They were believed to have extra long lifespans and to be able to project their spirits and appear to people from a distance. The Masters' main purpose was to guide the development of humanity, which they did by influencing human culture, by revealing spiritual teachings, and by training worthy people in the esoteric arts. According to Blavatsky, most of the Masters lived in secret retreats in the Himalayas, where she claimed to have visited them on one of her journeys. Among them Among the masters were famous religious figures like Jesus and Buddha, but also characters that were unique to Theosophical mythology, like Master Kurtumi. As we have seen, the Theosophical Society relocated to India some years after it was founded. There are probably several reasons for this, but one of them was the fact that India played an important role in the teachings of Theosophy. According to Theosophical writers, the original esoteric wisdom, which they believed to have existed in ancient times, had spread around the world and was present in all or most of the world's religions. According to Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, India and Indian religions were especially important here. Although different opinions existed regarding this within the movement, many Theosophists argued that Buddhism and Hinduism had preserved more of the original ancient wisdom than most other religions. Although early Theosophy had a comparatively large impact on some of the cultural and religious trends in the 20th century, it is primarily one of these aspects that is the focus of this lecture. Research has shown that Theosophy, with its large early membership in South Asia, as well as a widespread belief in the importance of Hinduism and Buddhism as inheritors of ancient wisdom, constituted one of the vehicles through which beliefs, practices, and social networks related to religions like Buddhism were established outside of Asia during the late 19th and early 20th century. Furthermore, the specific theosophical interpretations of religions like Buddhism may have colored the early reception of those religions in Europe and North America. In order to illustrate these points, I will now take a deeper look at one of the local contexts in Europe where the theosophical movement established a presence in the late 19th century.